Welcome again to this Easter weekend edition of the Sense Crusade. Easter is, of course, a commemoration of Christ's resurrection. And I say, of course, but I wonder how many people will be considering the meaning of Easter this weekend. Attendance at Easter church services had dropped by 66% in just a decade. And only 46.2% of people in England and Wales identify as Christian these days. Britain is no longer a majority Christian nation, and the impact is felt when, as happened this week at Oxford, a college reportedly cancelled its annual St George's Day dinner in favour of an Islamic iftar. That despite a Magdalene College spokesman saying all major Christian festivals are celebrated. That all brings us to this week's Duel, and to debate this topic, I'm joined by my duelists, my sidekick Emma Webb, and this week's nemesis, founder of Novora Media, Aaron Bastani. Emma, has Christian culture been de-Christianized?
I think so, and I think that there's something very telling in that quote that you just read out there from Magdalene College, which is that they celebrate every major Christian festival, implying that St George's Day is not a major or important Christian festival that's worth celebrating. I think all you have to do is take one quick look at, this is speaking of the Church of England, not of the majority of Anglicans or even the majority of Catholics or Protestants or otherwise. But the Church of England in particular, I think, has become de-Christianised. You just have to take one quick scroll through their website and you can see that it's absolutely shrouded with corporate speak rather than traditional Christian language. There's an abandonment of traditional doctrine and actually, I think, an attitude almost of sort of cringing towards a lot of the traditions of the church. And part of this, I think, is, that bringing in extraneous ideas from outside of Christianity. You see it within theology, with bringing in critical race theory, other progressive ideologies. But there's an awful lot going on. But I think actually the reason why we're seeing this decline in Christian numbers is because people don't want to attend church services that aren't meaningful, where you feel that the clergy don't really truly believe in the gospel. If people are attracted to Christianity, it's because they're attracted to the truth. And I think that this sort of cringing, self-deprecating attitude that the church has taken on, as well as a sort of lack of belief in its own ideas and taking on all of these external, predominantly secular ideas, or you might say some new religious ideas, I think that is part of the problem and that is contributing to the decline.
A lot to break down there. It sounds like Emma thinks it's doctrinal, it's theological, it's also community, and the language that's being used. What do you say, Aaron? Is Christianity being de-Christianized?
I think there's a lot there. I had a few separate points which perhaps you guys wouldn't necessarily agree with. The first is we live in a capitalist society. And whether or not you're a fan of that, there's a gentleman called Karl Marx who had some very important insights.
Someone's a strong word there. Aaron.
Yeah, well, those are my words, not yours. About 170 years ago, he wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. Now, why am I talking about that? From the perspective of religion, there's a great phrase. He says, all that is holy is profaned, all that is solid melts into air. All that is sacred is profaned, all that is solid melts into air. Which is to say that in a capitalist system, everything becomes for profit. And I think most of your viewers will understand that, this idea of the subordination of everything that we really value becoming about profit and about marketing and about public relations and about big business. So that's not a new insight, it's a relatively old one. So I would say that's part of the bigger picture here. But then I think also, look, my wife is Maltese, she's from Southern Europe. And I suppose that there's a difference here between Catholicism and Protestantism. But that is a country like here, which has adopted over time more secular mores. There have been changes with regards to legislation, abortion and whatnot, divorce, and yet at a community level people still take Saints' Days incredibly seriously. Young, old, believer, non-believer, although it's important to say that believers are far more likely there than here. This is a very secular country, has been for a very long time, but it's interesting that community aspect of faith still plays a huge role, particularly in Southern Europe. And it's interesting, as Brits, we look at Italy, we look at Spain, we look at Malta or wherever. Isn't this charming? Isn't this wonderful? Yeah. We have the exact same thing here, but we don't seem to value it when it's at home.
But what's the difference there? Because they're all capitalist countries too.
No, it's a really good point. I think the Catholic faith. Look, this is a bit above my station on a Saturday. There's a gentleman called Max Weber who said that Protestantism was the perfect religious faith to go hand in hand with the rise of capitalism after the 16th century. But park that, very complex. I think Catholicism as a faith is probably a little bit better immunised from this idea of everything being subordinated to profit and commercialisation. Not perfectly so, but a little bit better.
Yeah. That does seem to be part of the problem, doesn't it? That authority. The Catholic Church has this magisterium, it has its papal infallibility, it has protections, guards against wokeness. And it does seem to be wokeness playing its hand here. If we look at the northwest of the country, Lancashire, Merseyside, Copeland, Cumbria, all roughly still 66% Christian. It's London and the southeast where, Tower Hamlets, for example, 22% Christian. No surprises there. So it's not just wokeness, there are other elements at play. But do you think wokeness is...
Well, I think actually I agree partially with what Aaron said, that liberal society does have a sort of bent towards atomization, and that is a problem. And I think possibly one of the reasons why you see less of a decline in the north is partly because it's sort of reasonably more homogenous. It's not one, with the exception of some of the major cities, it's not a kind of like cosmopolitan centre. And so those sorts of areas always hold on to traditions longer, no matter what country you're in. But I do think that the church has given up on it in many ways. I think the Anglican Church specifically has given up on sort of the core of its own beliefs and traditions, and perhaps is looking towards social justice ideas and progressive ideology, particularly critical theory, and in some cases particular strands of theology, liberation theology, that draw on critical theory. So this is getting very complicated. But I think that they may see in that misplaced. They may see in that the church's salvation, as it were, that they think that this is going to get bums on pews, when in reality, what really attracts people, and I think they're mistaken in thinking that young people 30 or under, are attracted to this, when the reality is, at least in my anecdotal experience, that what young people are really thirsty for is to be, preach the gospel in a way that is sincere and authentic and not cringing and ashamed. I think a lot of people, when they say that they're Christians, they say it in a kind of cringing way, as if they have to be apologetic about it. And we see that en masse as a society, culturally. I think and particularly with institutions, there's either a sort of like cringing hesitancy to recognise the Christian roots of our country or institutions, or there is an active sort of iconoclasm and vandalism towards it. And I think that is, again, comes out of a misplaced sense of guilt. And I think they truly do believe that if they look to these new ideas, that they will find their salvation in those ideas rather than in the ideas of the gospel.
Again, so much packed in there, Emma. I want to call Aaron up on two of these points that you raised. So firstly, the iconoclasm and the whole embarrassment about being Christian. So you two both prayed the Lord's Prayer with me just then. I'm thankful that you did. But were you embarrassed about doing that?
Not especially. I mean, it's important to say, millions of people... I was saying earlier, actually, I did it every morning at school and in primary school as a child. Yeah. And my presumption is that's still a common event. I mean, perhaps it isn't. I mean, I am unfortunately getting old, so that's. But so for me, it's a very commonplace, everyday thing. I think it's also a very powerful message, even if you don't necessarily believe in God. I think the idea of forgiveness is the key message of the gospel, and it's an incredibly powerful and potent message. And for me, the big takeaway, and it's exactly what you were saying, really, and I think it sounds like a trick is being missed, really, by more powerful people, particularly in the Church of England, which is that young people, all people, frankly, but young people, are desperately in search of meaning and desperately in search of a sense of higher purpose in life. And we see this, by the way, throughout, commercial culture. We see it with journaling, meditations, and all this stuff.
The New Age stuff.
Yeah, we humans have sought to meet those needs since forever. And actually, the old ways, were very effective at doing it. And like I say, forgiveness, the idea of forgiveness is such a powerful one for me. And I think whether or not you believe in God, whether or not you're a practicing Christian, I think it's an extraordinary transformational way to live your life.
And I do want to ask you about social justice as well, because I assume that you and I would disagree on approaches to social justice, but I think we'd probably agree on the fact that the church should be looking at its own history in social justice, in feeding the poor, in almshouses, in charity, all these things, setting up hospitals, schools, all things that the church has historically been good at. But now they've forgotten that history and they seem to be looking to social norms and chasing what I would call wokeness. You might disagree on that, but at least I imagine you'd agree that it's looking in the wrong direction.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm a socialist, if your audience hasn't already worked that out. And so obviously my
We won't hold that against you.
Yeah, my particular read, you know, I look at the gospel as actually a message of, in the context of 2,000 years ago in West Asia, of revolutionary justice. Now, some people could say, was that for this world or for the next, and so on, but I think that's the broad message there. And you can go throughout, not just the New Testament, the Old one too, ideas of debt jubilees, like say, helping the poor, feeding the hungry, vanquishing the powerful. So there is very much a political and economic message there of lifting other people up.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. To an extent, that's not there anymore. You know, every couple of years we have Justin Welby. I'm not a big fan of Justin Welby, I have to say. Every couple of years...
I'd like to give some balance, but neither am I.
Yeah, Ofcom might not...
This is turning out to be not so much of a jewel.
Yeah. No, but what I don't like about Justin Welby, and it's not my faith, so I don't think it's my business to sort of drop in on this, he talks so much about social justice and so on, but he does so little. He delivers so little. And I don't know, and you know...
He's not here to answer for himself, but we could go into a whole topic on what Justin Welby does and does not do.